Welcome to Zoe Stories. How I Became a Girl After Being Kidnapped. Ethan had always been the quiet one. The kid who kept to himself, glued to his books or the latest game, and avoided the noise of the world around him. His life, though outwardly normal, was defined by a simmering dissatisfaction, a sense that he didn't quite belong in his own skin. Growing up, he'd always felt disconnected from the expectations placed on him as a boy. He didn't fit the mold of the typical, manly man that society seemed to expect him to be. He liked video games, sure, but he also liked fashion. He liked hanging out with his friends, but he didn't want to talk about sports or cars all the time. These feelings of misalignment weren't something Ethan could easily articulate, not even to his closest friends. It wasn't that he didn't try. It was more that he didn't know how to voice what felt like an unexplainable void inside him. So, he kept everything locked away, buried deep within, afraid of the repercussions if anyone ever found out that he didn't feel entirely comfortable in his own skin. One night, while walking home from a late-night convenience store run, Ethan's life took a drastic turn. He'd always been cautious, aware of his surroundings, but this night was different. A sudden blow to the back of his head left him dizzy and disoriented. Before he could even register what was happening, a sharp tug on his arm yanked him off his feet, and everything went black. When Ethan woke up, he was somewhere unfamiliar, alone in a dark room with no windows and only the faint sound of distant footsteps. His first thought was that he was dreaming, but as his mind cleared and panic set in, he realized it was all too real. His life, already filled with internal conflict, was about to take a turn he never could have imagined. What was this kidnapping about? Who were these people? And most terrifyingly, why did he have the unsettling feeling that they were about to change him forever? Ethan's eyes flickered open to the cold, harsh light of a sterile room. He tried to move, but his wrists were bound tightly to a chair. The taste of metal lingered in his mouth, and his head throbbed, the memories of what had happened, being dragged away, the sharp pain at the back of his skull, flooded back in flashes. Panic set in as he struggled against the restraints, but it was useless. He scanned the room. Pale concrete walls. A dim, flickering light overhead. The air was thick with the scent of something antiseptic, like a hospital room or a basement. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to recall how he'd ended up here, but nothing came. He wasn't in his house. He wasn't anywhere familiar. The door to the room creaked open, and Ethan tensed, his breath catching in his throat. A tall figure stepped inside, dressed in black, their face obscured by a mask. The figure paused, assessing him with a cold gaze that made a chill crawl up Ethan's spine. "You're awake." The voice was muffled but firm, the tone impersonal, almost mechanical. "Good." Ethan's mouth went dry. "What's going on?" he croaked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want with me?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they walked around Ethan, observing him from every angle. The silence was suffocating. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of thoughts, but nothing made sense. He had no enemies, no reason for someone to abduct him, unless they wanted something more. "You're special," the figure said finally, their voice heavy with an unsettling calm. "But you're not yet who you need to be." The words hit Ethan like a slap to the face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, struggling against the restraints again, his fear morphing into confusion. He tried to stand up, but his legs were too shaky, his head too heavy. "You'll understand soon," the figure replied, turning away. "For now, you'll stay here. We have plans for you." With that, the door slammed shut, leaving Ethan in the suffocating darkness, unable to make sense of what was happening or why it was happening to him. As the silence enveloped him again, a terrifying realization settled over him. Whatever plans these people had for him, they were about to change everything. The next few days blurred together, a cycle of isolation, confusion, and increasing fear. Ethan was kept in the same sterile room, fed only sporadically, with little contact from the outside world. His captors, whoever they were, refused to answer his questions. Whenever he demanded an explanation, the only response was silence or a cryptic, chilling phrase like, "You'll understand soon." His body had begun to ache from the restraints. His mind, however, was a storm. Every waking moment was consumed with questions. Who had taken him? Why him? What did they want from him? His only answer came in the form of the strange, unmarked syringes they injected him with when he wasn't looking, and the pills they slipped into his food. Ethan couldn't ignore the growing sense of change in his own body. At first, it was subtle, a slight soreness in his chest, an odd tenderness in his hips. Then it became undeniable. His skin, which had once been rough from years of outdoor work, now felt smoother. His hair seemed to be growing thicker and softer, falling in waves over his forehead. He noticed it first in the cracked, grimy mirror they'd left in his cell. His eyes widened as he studied his reflection. His jawline, once angular, had softened. His face, always a little too sharp for his liking, was beginning to take on a more delicate shape. He ran his fingers over his face, disbelief flashing through him. "What the hell is happening to me?" he whispered, staring at his reflection. But the changes didn't stop there. His body, once lean from his job at the garage, had begun to soften in odd places, his thighs and hips gaining weight. His chest, too, was starting to swell, and a subtle roundness replaced the flatness he was used to. Each day that passed seemed to bring more changes, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more his body betrayed him. He wanted to believe it was some sort of sick joke, a dream he could wake from. But the tightening of his clothes and the unfamiliar changes in his body were undeniable. Something far worse was happening. Someone was doing this to him. One day, as he lay on the cold concrete floor of his cell, trying to push away the horror that was creeping through his veins, the door opened again. The same masked figure entered, but this time they weren't alone. A woman stepped in behind them, her eyes sharp and calculating. She was tall, with a stern expression and dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. She stood there for a moment, surveying Ethan with cold interest, then spoke. "It's happening, isn't it?" she said, her voice clipped. Ethan didn't respond immediately. His chest tightened and his mind raced. "Happening? What's happening?" "I know it's unsettling," the woman continued, ignoring his silence. "But it's necessary. You're going to be different. And you're going to be important." Ethan shook his head, confusion clouding his mind. "What do you mean? What is all this? Why are you doing this to me?" The woman stepped closer, examining his face with clinical detachment. "You were chosen for this, Ethan, because you have the potential. You'll become something more, something greater than you could ever have imagined." She paused, her gaze sharpening as she added, "But only if you accept what's coming." Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't want this. I don't want any part of this. Please, just let me go." The woman's lips curled into a thin, almost pitying smile. "You don't have a choice. Not anymore. We've already started. The process is in motion." "Process?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "What the hell are you talking about?" She met his eyes with a steady, unwavering gaze. "You're going to be transformed, Ethan. You're going to become the person you were meant to be. A woman." Ethan recoiled as though she'd slapped him. "No. No, I can't be. This is insane. I'm a man. I'm not some experiment." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You will be. And there's no going back." Ethan's heart raced. He had always identified as a man, his life, his work, his identity. Everything was tied to that. The thought of being changed, being forced into something he couldn't control, was too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to fight, to resist, the reality of his body's changes made it harder every day to deny what was happening. His chest was no longer flat. His hips were widening, and the softness of his skin, the lightness of his frame, made it impossible to ignore. Even his reflection in the mirror, with its increasingly feminine features, confronted him with the horrifying truth. The woman stepped back, giving him space. "There's no use fighting it. You'll be given everything you need to accept this transformation. But the question is, how long will it take for you to want it?" Ethan was left alone again, but the silence in the room was deafening. His world had been turned upside down, and there was no escaping it. He no longer felt in control of his own body, and with each passing hour, It became harder to see the person he had once been in the stranger staring back at him from the mirror. As the days wore on, the changes became even more pronounced. His once short hair now fell in soft waves, brushing the nape of his neck. His body continued to shift, his clothes growing tighter around his chest and hips. He felt less like the man he had once been, and more like a stranger in his own skin. And still, he couldn't escape the nagging thought that perhaps he wasn't meant to be what he had been. That somehow, this transformation was his destiny. He wondered if this was all a dream, but with each shift of his body, with each new reflection, he began to realize that this was no fantasy. This was real, and there was no going back. His world had changed in ways he couldn't control, and the only question that remained was whether he could learn to accept it, or if it would break him in the process. The fear that had plagued Ethan for weeks had finally culminated in a suffocating reality. One morning, he awoke to find himself locked in a strange, sterile room, bathed in cold fluorescent light. The door slammed open, and the woman, the one who had first explained the process to him, entered, her face unreadable. This time, however, something was different. Her gaze held an urgency, a tightness that unsettled him. "You're not ready," she said, her voice laced with a rare tension. Ethan's heart pounded. "What do you mean, not ready? What else could you possibly do to me?" He flinched as he felt the tightening in his chest, his body betraying him, the soft curves on his chest, the weight that had accumulated on his hips. His reflection haunted him. He was barely recognizable, a strange fusion of the man he used to be and the woman they were forcing him to become. The woman stepped closer, her eyes piercing his. "You're resisting, Ethan. But you can't keep fighting this. You're on the brink of a breakthrough. It's time to let go." "No," Ethan shouted, standing up. "I'm not doing this. I'm not going to be some experiment." She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small syringe filled with a strange, glowing liquid. Ethan recoiled instinctively, the sense of danger sending a shiver down his spine. "Take it," she demanded, her tone firm. "This is the final step. Once it's done, you won't be able to change back. But you'll finally understand." Ethan felt panic rise in his chest. He had felt powerless for weeks, his body reshaping itself without his consent. But this was his final choice. He could either take the syringe and submit to the transformation or resist and face whatever consequence they had prepared for him. The pressure mounted with each passing second. His mind raced, torn between fury and the dawning understanding that perhaps, just maybe, there was no escaping what was happening to him. Was he doomed to live a life of rejection, fear, and anger for the rest of his days? Or could he finally embrace this change, whatever it meant, and find some shred of peace within the chaos? He took a shaky breath. His hand reached out toward the syringe. He didn't know what would happen once the liquid entered his veins, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep fighting the inevitable. He had to choose. Not just for them, but for himself. The moment the needle pierced his skin, everything in his body went still. He gasped, the strange warmth of the liquid coursing through his veins. His chest tightened in an almost painful way, but it was a different feeling now, familiar, as though it had been meant to happen all along. The world around him seemed to fade as the transformation began to accelerate, each sensation, each shift in his body, drawing him into a place he had never thought possible. He crumbled to his knees, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions, the realization that he was no longer just fighting a physical change. He was fighting himself, his identity, his very sense of who he was. But in that moment, as the warmth spread through him, he understood something. He wasn't just becoming someone else. He was uncovering a version of himself that had always existed, buried deep beneath the layers of who he had been. With the weight of the transformation heavy on his shoulders, Ethan closed his eyes and made peace with the uncertainty. The fear, the anger, the panic, they all melted away, leaving only the fragile, yet powerful, understanding that this change, however forced upon him, could be the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. It was the moment when Ethan stopped fighting, and for the first time, he embraced what was happening, both to his body and his soul. The moments after the syringe pierced Ethan's skin felt like a blur, but as the transformation took hold, he could no longer ignore the reality of what was happening. The room seemed to shrink around him, its cold walls pressing in as his body twisted and contorted. He barely registered the footsteps of the woman approaching him again, her expression unreadable, but there was a trace of satisfaction in her eyes. "Do you feel it now?" she asked, her voice quieter, almost sympathetic. "Do you understand what it means to let go?" Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. He looked down at his hands, now more delicate, the nails painted, the skin soft. The once familiar weight of his body had shifted, and he could feel every curve, every change that had been imposed upon him. But strangely, there was no longer any resistance. There was no more fight in him. His mind, though still rattled by the force of the change, had settled into a state of reluctant acceptance. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his voice sounding different, softer, unfamiliar. The woman knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "Now you find your way through this. There's no going back, but you can make something new out of what you've become. The choice is yours. You're no longer the person you were before. How you embrace this is entirely up to you." Ethan took a long, steadying breath, his hands resting on his thighs as he let the words sink in. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Will I ever go back home?" he whispered, his heart heavy. He had been taken, changed, and used, but was there any hope for a life beyond this? He had no answers, but the weight of the unknown no longer terrified him as it had before. "You can choose to leave," the woman said. "You can rebuild your life however you wish. But that life will be different. And it will take time for you to understand who you've become." Ethan stood slowly, his new body strange under his own control. He felt the weight of the decision before him. This wasn't the future he had envisioned, but it was the one he had been forced into. Yet, in a strange way, there was a flicker of hope, a chance for reinvention, a life beyond the confines of his past. With the door open before him, Ethan looked over his shoulder at the woman, who now seemed more like an ally than an adversary. "Thank you," he said, barely able to whisper the words, but they felt genuine. His voice trembled with uncertainty, but something deeper, an emerging sense of strength, quietly filled the void. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. And with that, Ethan stepped out of the room, leaving behind the remnants of who he once was, stepping into a future that, for the first time, felt entirely his to shape. Weeks passed in a haze of new routines and unfamiliar faces. Ethan, now Elena, had carefully crafted her life in the aftermath of the transformation, building something from the shards of her old existence. She had learned to navigate the world with new eyes, eyes that once felt like strangers in her own face, but had now become her own. She had embraced her new identity not out of resignation, but with a growing sense of purpose. Elena had started a new job at a boutique, helping to manage inventory and design displays. She took pride in her work, her hands now skilled at handling delicate fabrics and her mind quick to spot patterns. She found an unexpected joy in it, a sense of fulfillment that she had never felt before. At night, she would stand in front of the mirror, studying the person who looked back at her, and for the first time since the transformation, she no longer felt like an imposter. Her old life, the one she had once thought she would return to, had faded into distant memories. The people she had known, family, friends, were still part of her past, but the relationships had changed in ways she could not have predicted. She had written letters, explaining her absence, her transformation, her need to be alone for a while. Some responded with anger, others with confusion, but a few offered their understanding, and that had been enough for her to start the journey of reconciliation when she was ready. It was during a quiet evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, that Elena realized something profound. She had spent so long running from this transformation, dreading the loss of everything she had known, but in doing so, she had been blind to the possibility of growth. She had been given a second chance, a chance to create her own life on her terms. The woman who had once been Ethan no longer existed, and in her place stood a person who had faced the most unimaginable of changes and had come out the other side stronger, more self-aware and free. The journey had been painful, yes, but it had also been a journey of reinvention, of discovering that identity is not something fixed. It is fluid, evolving, and ultimately something we can define for ourselves. As she gazed out the window, the city skyline stretching beyond her apartment, Elena smiled softly to herself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it was hers to walk. And whatever happened next, she was no longer afraid to see where it would lead. Thank you for joining us on another captivating journey through Zoe's stories. Remember to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale. Until next time, keep exploring, keep imagining, and keep believing in the magic of storytelling. See you in the next chapter.